Hank Morrow was staring at the worn-out tires of his pickup, wondering if he could squeeze another 1,000 miles out of them, when something happened that would shift the entire course of his life. He had no idea that the simple act of offering mechanical help to a stranger stranded on the side of a dusty road could set in motion an unexpected sequence of events that would renew his faith in people, bring hope back to his struggling farm, and open doors he never even knew existed. Before we carry on, let me know where you are watching from in the comments, and hit the subscribe button for something special tomorrow. Now, let's step onto the windy back road where Hank was buying feed for his livestock, never suspecting that an older man's truck troubles would turn into a life-altering chapter he'd remember forever. Hank Morrow was accustomed to the steady hum of hard work, the unrelenting ache of financial stress, and the subtle anxiety that came from waking each day knowing the land he worked was slipping through his fingers. He lived on a small, ragged property that he had inherited from his father many years ago, a collection of sheds and barns scattered across fields that had once brimmed with healthy crops. His father had once called it Morrow Acres, though over time, Hank had come to think of it as Morrow's last stand, since every season seemed like a final battle to keep the property from succumbing to the banks and creditors. The land had potential, or at least that was what he told himself whenever he walked the perimeter and studied the soil. But he couldn't deny the exhaustion that had settled over him ever since his wife passed away 5 years back. He was alone now, with only his old dog Barney for company, and he often felt that the days of real prosperity had left along with the final harvest of his father's era. Living on the outskirts of a town so small it barely had a stoplight, Hank had few neighbors. Most folks who stayed in such remote areas were tough and self-sufficient, familiar with the dryness that came in summer and the bitter cold that arrived each winter. Hank's daily ritual was as predictable as the sun's journey across the sky. He would roll out of bed before dawn, check on his meager livestock, some chickens, a couple of goats, and a few head of cattle that remained from the herd he could once afford. Then drive into town if he had errands. That morning, he needed to pick up feed for his animals. The feed store was 10 miles away, a route that cut across farmland, a few dusty roads, and a stretch of highway that usually carried more trucks than cars. He had loaded the back of his pickup with the minimal feed he could afford, counting the bills carefully when he paid, gritting his teeth as he reminded himself that every penny mattered. In the back of his mind, he rehearsed the calculations of how long that feed would last before he had to buy more. The conversation with the store manager played on repeat. "Things are tough all over, Hank," the manager had said, patting Hank's shoulder sympathetically when he saw Hank wince at the rising feed prices. Hank had forced a half-smile, quietly acknowledging that yes, times were indeed tough. With the feed purchased, he set out for home. The road stretched before him under a pale sun, and he found his thoughts drifting to the possibility of renting out part of his land. But who would want to lease patchy, overworked fields? He'd considered it before, but his attempts to attract interest had fallen flat. The land needed capital to improve drainage, an updated irrigation system, better seeds, and the kind of investment that was hard to come by when you were already knee-deep in debt. A sigh slipped from his lips as he rumbled along, the old truck's engine growling in a comforting, if somewhat labored, tone. He spotted another vehicle on the side of the road. It was an older model truck, battered and paint-chipped, clearly in distress. Its hazard lights blinked in a forlorn rhythm, the hood propped open. Hank eased off the gas, debating whether to stop or keep going. After all, it was a scorching day, and he still had plenty of work to do. But then he remembered a lesson his father used to drill into him. A man's worth is measured by what he does when nobody's paying attention. Hank sighed, flicked his turn signal, and pulled off the road behind the stranded truck. He parked and climbed out, surveying the scene. A tall older man in a dusty plaid shirt and jeans was rummaging under the hood. The man stepped back when he heard Hank's door shut, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of a worn hand. He had a kind, weathered face, with hair that had turned silver and a slight stoop in his posture, suggesting years of laborious work, or perhaps just the weight of time. When he spotted Hank approaching, he raised a polite wave. Hank returned the gesture, pushing aside his own exhaustion to force a welcoming nod. "Everything all right here?" Hank asked, glancing at the engine. He knew a bit about trucks, mostly from necessity. Living on a farm meant you learned to handle mechanical breakdowns yourself, or else spend money you didn't have. The older man shook his head. "Engine just quit on me," he said in a gravelly voice. "Lost power, and then it started smoking, so I pulled over. I'm no mechanic, so I'm guessing something's gone wrong with the belts, or maybe the radiator. Name's Ben, by the way." "A-A-N-C, Hank," Hank replied, stretching out a hand. They shook, a firm, respectful greeting between two men who understood that help could be scarce on the remote roads. "Mind if I take a look?" "Be my guest," Ben said, stepping aside. Hank propped himself against the front fender, careful of the heat radiating from the metal. The engine compartment was indeed hot, and he used a rag from his truck's toolbox to protect his hand while examining the belts. He spotted some fraying on the serpentine belt, but the culprit seemed more like a radiator issue. Steam still hissed from a small crack in the upper radiator hose. "Looks like you've got a crack in this hose," Hank said, reaching for a flashlight. "You're probably losing coolant. Got any water with you?" Ben shook his head. "Just a canteen. Already poured that in earlier. Didn't do much good." Hank nodded grimly. "Might be able to patch it temporarily, get you limping down the road. I have some duct tape and water in my pickup. You live around here, or just passing through?" Ben hesitated, a thoughtful look crossing his features. "You could say I'm passing through. Got some business in these parts. Was hoping to meet a few folks and get acquainted." The man offered no further details, and Hank didn't pry. Instead, he grabbed water from his truck, poured it into the radiator as best he could, and fashioned a makeshift bandage out of duct tape for the hose. He knew it was far from a perfect fix, but if they could get the truck started, maybe Ben could reach the next service station. They worked side by side, sweat trickling down their necks as the sun blazed overhead. Hank was used to manual labor, but even so, the midday heat was oppressive. Ben helped where he could, handing Hank tools or shining the flashlight under the hood. Occasionally they exchanged small talk. Ben mentioned how he had traveled to various states, often helping folks with mechanical projects, but he never elaborated on exactly why. Hank, for his part, admitted to being a farmer with a patch of land that had been in the family for decades. Eventually, Hank tried the ignition. The truck sputtered, coughed, and then roared to a meager life, spitting out a little more smoke before settling into a shaky idle. Ben exhaled in relief. "Didn't think it would start again," he said, a crooked grin on his face. "It probably won't get you too far," Hank said, stepping back carefully. "But there's a small service station about 7 miles down this road. With luck, you'll make it there before the patch fails. I'd follow you, but I've got livestock to feed. You should probably keep your speed low and watch that temperature gauge. If it starts climbing too high, pull over and let it cool." Ben nodded, gratitude shining in his eyes. "You've done more than enough for me already. Not everyone stops to help a stranger these days. Thank you, Hank. Truly." Hank patted the hood lightly, as if reassuring the battered truck. "Safe travels, Ben. Let's hope you get it fixed properly soon." Ben shook Hank's hand again. There was a kind of sincerity in that handshake that struck Hank as unusual, an almost weighty sense of appreciation. He watched as Ben gingerly eased his truck back onto the road, the hazard lights still flashing. Hank stayed there on the shoulder until the vehicle vanished around a bend, feeling oddly uplifted by the small act of assisting someone in need. He climbed into his own truck, turned the engine over, and headed home, the feet in the back rattling with every bump in the pavement. The rest of his day unfolded with its usual routine. He fed the animals, cursed the dryness of the pastures, and spent an hour tinkering with a finicky irrigation valve. Thoughts of Ben drifted through his mind occasionally, but he didn't dwell on them. Life on the farm had a way of swallowing up extra mental space. By evening, as the sky took on a dusky orange hue, Hank allowed himself a few minutes to sit on his porch and watch the horizon. He thought about how his father had once told him that kindness was a farmer's greatest tool, because on the land, everybody needed everybody else sooner or later. A few days slipped by. Hank rose before dawn to water the animals, fix fences, and make endless calls to see if anyone was interested in renting his unused acreage. He had about 50 acres sitting fallow, land he simply couldn't afford to plant properly. The bank, meanwhile, sent more letters reminding him of overdue payments on the mortgage. The weight of debt pressed on him constantly, keeping him awake at night and consuming his daydreams with visions of foreclosure. He felt stuck in a perpetual loop of near desperation, always scrounging for a break that never quite came. Exactly a week after helping Ben, Hank found himself finishing an afternoon chore unloading a new bale of hay from the battered trailer behind his pickup. He felt the familiar ache in his back as he tried to maneuver the large bundle into his barn, cursing under his breath when the string holding the bale together snagged on a rusty nail. The air was still and humid, and he was dripping sweat onto the dusty barn floor. Tired, frustrated, and yearning for any sign of good news, he nearly jumped out of his skin when he heard the gravel crunch in the driveway. He stepped out of the barn, squinting in the bright sunlight. A truck he didn't immediately recognize was rolling up to the house, a swirl of dust trailing behind. He shaded his eyes with one hand, heart pounding from the sudden interruption in his daily solitude. Then, he saw the driver's door open, then hopped out, looking in much better spirits than the last time they met. He wore the same plaid shirt style, but this one was cleaner, and his face carried a friendly smile. Hank noticed the truck was still old, but it wasn't spewing smoke. Maybe the service station had done a decent job patching it up. "Hank," Ben called out, raising a hand in greeting. "Good to see you. Hope I'm not interrupting?" Hank shook his head, wiping sweat from his brow. "Ben, right? Didn't expect to see you again. How's that truck running?" Ben patted the fender affectionately. "It's better now. Local mechanic replaced the radiator hose, checked a bunch of other stuff. Surprised me that it didn't need more major repairs. Anyway, I was passing through the region again. Thought I might drop by if that's all right." Hank shrugged, trying not to let his curiosity get the best of him. "Sure. I was just unloading some hay. Not exactly glamorous work, but it's got to be done. You want a glass of water or something?" Ben nodded. "That sounds good. Got something I'd like to talk to you about if you have a minute." Intrigue bubbled up in Hank's mind. He motioned toward the farmhouse, and they walked inside, leaving behind the half-unloaded hay bale. The interior of Hank's home was modest. The living room was cluttered with farm invoices, dog-eared catalogs, and old newspapers. He cleared some space at the small dining table, nodding for Ben to have a seat. Then he grabbed 2 glasses and filled them with water from the tap, silently hoping the well wasn't about to run dry in the scorching summer. Barney, the old dog, ambled over, sniffing at the newcomer. Ben took a sip, sighing contentedly. "Thank you. I never take cool water for granted anymore." He set the glass down and pulled a thin folder from his back pocket, placing it carefully on the table. Hank noticed the crispness of the papers and the sense of purpose in Ben's movements. "So, Hank," Ben began, leaning forward slightly, "I told you I was passing through this region for some business. The truth is, I'm looking at land opportunities out here. I traveled to a bunch of states over the last few months, hoping to find farmland that could be leased, or that might benefit from certain development projects. I have a small firm, well, not so small, I guess, that specializes in helping older farmers or struggling landowners revitalize their properties. We sometimes enter partnerships, do lease agreements, or propose conservation projects if that's more suitable. It depends on the land and the owner's needs." Hank's brow furrowed. He wasn't sure if he was hearing this correctly. You're interested in farmland around here?" Ben nodded. "Specifically, I'm interested in your land." A moment of silence passed, broken only by Barney's soft panting. Hank blinked, uncertain if he was misunderstanding. "You want to buy my property?" Ben shook his head, expression calm. "Not buy it. Lease it, but under terms that might surprise you. It's complicated, so let me explain." He opened the folder, revealing a set of neatly typed legal papers. "I represent a small philanthropic organization that invests in farmland preservation. We help farmers by leasing portions of their unused land for a nominal fee. In some cases, we pay for improvements in exchange for partial harvest shares, or for setting aside land for conservation. We also provide funds for infrastructure, like irrigation. Our goal is to keep farmland in the hands of those who are passionate about working it rather than seeing it sold off to developers who might pave it over for yet another strip mall. Hank's heart was already pounding. He'd heard of farmland preservation groups, but never dreamed one would find him out in the middle of nowhere. He swallowed nervously, turning his gaze down to the papers. "You sure you're not just pulling my leg? Because I can't afford to lease any more land, and I sure as heck can't pay for improvements right now." Ben smiled kindly. "We wouldn't be asking you to pay. In fact, we're offering to lease your unused land from you, but the lease would require that you allow us to make certain improvements that stay with the land. For instance, if you have unused acreage that's fallow, we might plant a crop that's good for rejuvenating the soil, or we might set up a small orchard if that suits the climate. We bear the costs. At the end of the year, you either keep your portion of the yield, or we share it, depending on the arrangement. We would like the right to set aside some acreage for a reforestation project as well, if that's feasible. In exchange for all of this, you receive not only the improvements, but also a nominal rental fee. We've done this with other farmers, and it's been very successful." Hank could feel confusion and hope mixing in a chaotic swirl inside him. It sounded too good to be true, especially for a man who had been told no by banks and investors for so long. Part of him wanted to jump at the offer, while another part, the more cautious side, screamed that deals like these often came with hidden hooks. He studied Ben's face, trying to detect any hint of deception. The older man's gaze was steady, earnest, and free of arrogance. "You said you do this for farmland preservation. Why me, though? There must be better, more fertile places you could invest in." Ben chuckled softly. "Because you helped me fix my truck when you could have just driven on by. You saved me a lot of grief. That's the kind of neighborly spirit I respect. The kind that farmland communities need. Besides, I did some checks on the acreage out here. The soil needs work, but it's not beyond redemption. More importantly, I believe in investing in people, not just land. You strike me as someone worth partnering with." Hank's throat felt tight. He took another sip of water, mind reeling with the possibilities. "This is a lot to take in. I'll be honest, I'm barely scraping by. If you folks want to put a project on my property, I won't stand in your way. But can I see the terms?" He gestured at the folder, then handed it over, flipping to the top page. "We can talk through the details. There's a standard outline of what we provide, like seeds, irrigation setups, the cost of labor for soil amendments, and how much produce or profit we split in return. Usually, we set it so the farmer retains a sizable portion. We also have provisions for land that's set aside entirely for reforestation or conservation. In that case, we pay you a small annual fee to maintain that agreement. So you lose no money by keeping that land out of commercial production." Hank skimmed over the text, feeling his heart race. The phrase "lease your unused land for free" rattled in his head, though he realized the arrangement was more nuanced than simply handing over land. Yet the mention of improvements, seeds, irrigation, and a share of revenue made his pulse quicken with cautious optimism. He also noticed an entire section about philanthropic goals, referencing a broader mission to bolster struggling rural communities by fostering sustainable agriculture. As he flipped a page, his gaze caught a bullet point, stating that the organization would assist with farmland debt consolidation if needed, offering to help renegotiate terms with banks under certain circumstances. His breath caught in his chest. Could they really do that? He pictured the foreclosure letters piling up in his living room, the dread that gnawed at him every time a new envelope arrived. Here was someone, a man named Ben, who had rolled onto his property saying they might help keep Morrow Acres afloat, and all of it traced back to a single instance of Hank stopping his truck on a hot day to lend a hand. Ben cleared his throat gently, as if sensing Hank's turmoil. "Listen, I know it sounds unbelievable, but I promise, the arrangement is beneficial for both sides. We get to fulfill our mission of preserving farmland, you get the help you need to keep working your property, and, hopefully, the community benefits from the improvements and any job opportunities that come from it. All I ask is that you read it over and think about it. We can sign whenever you're comfortable, or not at all. No pressure." The sheer relief, mixed with astonishment, nearly overwhelmed Hank. He set the folder on the table, letting out a shaky breath. "I don't know what to say. You're like a miracle dropped out of the sky. I'm not used to things going my way, and I want to be sure I'm not missing a catch." Ben folded his hands. "Ask me anything you like. The catch, if there is one, is that we have a mission for reforestation and soil rehabilitation. We might request certain practices, like reduced chemical use or sustainable planting methods, especially if we're installing drip irrigation and the like. Some farmers balk because they want to do things the traditional way, but we found that with a little guidance, people adapt well. Also, we ask for a minimum term, usually 3 years, so we can see the full benefit of the improvements. Beyond that, we're flexible. Hank nodded, absorbing the information. He recalled the frustration of trying to nurse his depleted fields back to health without the finances to buy better fertilizer or upgrade the irrigation lines. Perhaps sustainable practices would help in the long run, not just for one harvest, but for future seasons. The notion that someone else would foot the bill for these changes felt like pure fantasy. Yet here was Ben, offering just that, because Hank had once offered him a bit of water and a patch job for his broken truck. They spent the next hour poring over the documents. Hank asked questions about specifics, such as the timeline for installing irrigation or whether he'd have to hire additional labor. Ben explained that the organization often sent teams of specialists, agronomists, irrigation experts, and seasonal workers paid for by the philanthropic fund to carry out the tasks. Hank would have a say in what was grown or how the land was used, but they would provide strong recommendations based on soil tests and market viability. By the time they finished, Hank felt both exhausted and invigorated, a flutter of hope in his chest that maybe, just maybe, the future wouldn't be so bleak. Eventually, Hank set the papers aside, turning his gaze to Ben. "I need a little time to read this thoroughly and maybe consult someone about it. My neighbor, Carl, has some experience reading legal documents. Mind if I get back to you in a couple of days?" Ben's smile was warm. "Take all the time you need. I'll be in town for a while, looking at other properties. You have my number there. And I'm staying at the Redwood Motel on Maple Street if you need to reach me. If you decide to pass, no hard feelings, Hank. But I do hope we can work something out." Hank escorted Ben back outside. The late afternoon sun glinted off the older man's truck, the mechanical trouble now just a memory. They shook hands again, and Ben drove away, leaving a trail of dust. Hank stood in his driveway for a moment, head swimming with possibility. Barney trotted up, panting, as if curious about the entire encounter. Hank bent down, ruffling the dog's ears. "You and me, boy? We might have just stumbled onto a lifeline," he murmured. That evening, he couldn't focus on chores as well as he normally did. His mind kept wandering to the promise of that folder, its typed lines of philanthropic partnership, and the idea that he might actually break the cycle of debt. He fed the chickens absent-mindedly, nearly dropping their feed because his hands were trembling with cautious excitement. By the time dusk settled, he felt so keyed up that he decided to walk the perimeter of his land, letting the cool evening air steady him. The fields were silent, save for the chirping of crickets and the rustle of a soft breeze. Hank gazed out at the unused acreage to the north, the fallow ground that had sat idle for years because he couldn't afford to plant. What if that land was soon buzzing with new life? What if that empty stretch became the ticket to saving Morrow Acres? He slept fitfully, dreams filled with images of sprouting crops, new fences, irrigation lines, and the bank rep at his doorstep, shaking Hank's hand instead of demanding payment. The next morning, he rose early, rummaging through the folder once more, reading the paragraphs carefully. The text was indeed written in plain language, referencing the philanthropic mission and how all improvements would remain with the property if the agreement ended. That last detail gave Hank pause. That meant that after the contract's term, all the improvements, from infrastructure to healthy soil amendments, would be his to keep. This arrangement was not a standard commercial lease he was used to hearing about, but a structured philanthropic partnership. He found no mention of a hidden cost or balloon payment. The organization's name, Green Horizons Initiative, was mentioned repeatedly, describing their philanthropic objectives to bolster struggling family farms. He decided to consult his neighbor, Carl Wallace, who was known to be a retired accountant. Carl lived about a mile away, and though he mostly kept to himself, he was friendly enough when asked for help. Hank hopped into his truck, winding along the dusty road until he reached Carl's small bungalow, hidden behind a row of tall hedges. Carl answered the door in paint-stained overalls. He was a wiry man in his 60s, with keen eyes behind wire-framed glasses. Upon hearing Hank's request, Carl nodded and gestured for him to come inside. For the next hour, Carl examined the folder, occasionally jotting notes on a pad. Hank sat in a worn armchair, fiddling with his hat. He studied Carl's face for hints, trying to guess what his neighbor was thinking, though Carl's expression remained stoic. Finally, Carl set the folder down and leaned back. "I've never seen something quite like this in all my years of accounting," he admitted, "but I don't see any trickery in it. Seems straightforward. They want to invest in your land, do improvements that align with sustainable farming or conservation, and in exchange, you lease them the right to do so. They pay you a small rental fee, which might help with your bills, and they pay for the installations. If you ask me, it's the kind of arrangement big cities sometimes do with land trusts, except more direct. The only real consideration is that you'll have to coordinate with their team. They'll want input on how the land is managed." Hank exhaled slowly. "So you think it's legit?" Carl shrugged. "As far as I can tell, yes. You might want to check references. There's a contact list in that folder. But personally, if I were in your position, I'd jump on it. Morrow Acres could use the upgrade, and you sure as heck could use the help with that mortgage." Hank felt a wave of relief. He thanked Carl, promising him a homemade pie or a home-cooked meal as soon as he could gather the ingredients. Then he left, the folder tucked carefully under his arm, his mind spinning with the beginnings of real hope. On the drive home, he debated whether to call Ben immediately or wait, but the excitement within him was too strong. As soon as he got back to the farmhouse, he found Ben's number and dialed it from the old rotary phone in his kitchen. The line rang only once before Ben picked up, his voice calm and friendly. "Hey, Ben," Hank began, throat dry. "This is Hank Morrow. About your offer, I'd like to move forward." Ben's tone lifted with a trace of enthusiasm. "That's great to hear, Hank. I'll come by tomorrow morning with a notary, if that's all right. We can sign the paperwork and start making some plans." Hank agreed, feeling a tiny sense of disbelief that it was all happening so fast. The next morning, Ben arrived with a woman named Sharon, who served as a notary public and also one of the legal advisors for the Green Horizons initiative. They spread out the documents on Hank's dining table, going through each one carefully. Sharon explained the specifics, including the timeline for their proposed improvements and the terms regarding any potential early termination. Hank listened, nodding, interjecting with the occasional question about how the arrangement might affect his existing mortgage. Sharon assured him that any improvements would be filed with the county as an asset to the land, which could actually help him renegotiate better terms with the bank, as his property's overall value would go up. Hank could hardly believe his ears. With a shaky hand, Hank signed each section, feeling as though he were rewriting his destiny in those fluid strokes of ink. Sharon placed her official stamp next to his signature, notarizing each page. Ben grinned, then reached across the table to shake Hank's hand. "Congratulations. You've just partnered with Green Horizons. We're going to do our best to make sure Morrow Acres thrives." A surge of emotion coursed through Hank, and he had to fight back the sting of tears. He thought of his father, the once proud and resourceful farmer whose health had declined before the land started to. He thought of his wife, who had believed in the potential of the soil even when it seemed to be fading away. If they could see this moment, Hank felt certain they'd be proud that he hadn't given up. He cleared his throat and returned the handshake. "I am grateful, Ben. More than you know." Almost immediately, the gears of change began to turn. Ben explained that a team would come out to perform a comprehensive soil analysis, collecting samples from various spots on Hank's unused acreage. They would check pH levels, nutrient content, and drainage capacity. A second group, including an agronomist named Rita and an irrigation specialist named Miguel, would then propose a plan for how best to restore fertility and what crops or reforestation methods would suit the climate. Hank was encouraged to share any ideas or preferences, as the goal was to work collaboratively. For the first time in years, Hank found himself buoyed by genuine excitement. His once listless routine was now charged with anticipation. He returned to his daily chores with renewed vigor, whistling tunelessly as he fed the chickens and goats, daydreaming about the transformation that would soon unfold on the property. Even the bank's ominous letters, which still arrived with disheartening regularity, lost some of their sting because Hank finally had an answer to cling to. Improvements were coming, and these improvements might help renegotiate the debt. He penned a cautious but firm letter to the bank, attaching copies of the newly signed lease agreement, explaining that substantial enhancements to the property's value were imminent. The letter ended with a polite suggestion to discuss the mortgage terms once those improvements were in place. Days after the paperwork was finalized, a group of vehicles rumbled up to the farmhouse, pickup trucks hauling trailers of equipment, a small SUV carrying soil specialists, and an old van with the green S&A Horizons logo on the side. Hank watched in awe as they spread out over the fields, collecting samples in carefully labeled bags, drilling small cores into the ground, and noting their findings in sturdy laptops. A tall woman with a warm smile introduced herself as Rita, the agronomist in charge of analyzing the land's potential. She explained that they would test for nitrogen levels, phosphorus, and potassium, and also check the topsoil depth. Hank nodded, fascinated by the level of science involved. In his father's day, they had done everything by feel and tradition, never once sending a soil sample to a lab. Miguel, the irrigation expert, was a wiry man who gestured excitedly with his hands, describing how drip systems or overhead pivots might revolutionize water usage. Hank listened, remembering how often he had struggled with a makeshift system of hoses and leaky sprinklers. As they examined the topography, Miguel talked about collecting data on slope, infiltration rates, and water sources. The passion in his voice reminded Hank that there was a whole world of modern farming technology out there, and he had been stumbling along in near isolation, too strapped for cash to learn about or implement it. Over the following weeks, the team worked at a pace that astonished Hank. First, they used tractors with specialized attachments to break up compacted soil. Then, they spread natural soil amendments, such as compost and lime, to balance pH levels. Hank helped where he could, driving his own battered tractor alongside them, feeling a sense of camaraderie he had long missed. In the evenings, he'd sit on the porch with Ben or Rita, or whomever else was around, discussing progress, plans for the next day, and how wonderful it was to see life returning to the land. Barney, his dog, seemed just as enthusiastic, trotting behind the crew and wagging his tail at every new face. As word spread through the small farming community about what was happening, curious neighbors dropped by to watch. Some offered a mix of admiration and envy, but Hank invited anyone who was interested to see what the Green Horizons folks were doing, hoping it might spark broader improvements across the region. Carl Wallace came by with his son, who was an agricultural student at a nearby college. They marveled at the modern equipment, the soil testing rigs, and the advanced water-saving sprinklers that were being laid out across Hank's previously barren fields. Hank proudly showed them around, explaining what he had learned. In truth, each day expanded his knowledge and confidence, making him believe in a future for Morrow Acres that was bright and sustainable. Ben made regular visits throughout this process, often checking in to see if Hank had any concerns or if the crew needed additional resources. One evening, after a particularly productive day of installing a new drip irrigation line, Hank invited him to stay for a home-cooked dinner. Over plates of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and fresh vegetables from Hank's small garden, they talked about what brought Ben into philanthropic farmland preservation in the first place. Ben, looking reflective, admitted that he had grown up on a farm that went under during a recession decades earlier. His family lost almost everything, which fueled his passion for helping others avoid the same fate. "That's why we started Green Horizons," Ben said quietly, tapping a finger on the edge of his plate. "We realized that good land was disappearing, swallowed by big developers. Families were losing generational farms just because they couldn't get a break. We wanted to be that break for people who might otherwise slip through the cracks. Working with folks like you, Hank, is the best part of what we do. Seeing your land come back to life and knowing your mortgage might not crush you well, that's all the thanks I need." Hank felt a lump in his throat. It was an odd sensation, having found someone who truly understood the heartbreak of losing farmland. He nodded, glancing around his modest kitchen, remembering his father's laughter echoing through the halls in better days. "I appreciate everything, more than words can say," he replied. "Just wish my dad and wife could see what's happening now. They both believed in this place, even when it started going downhill." Ben's eyes softened. "I'm sure they'd be proud of how you've persevered, Hank. And I can see how much love you have for the land. This isn't just about money to you, is it?" Hank shook his head. "No. It's about preserving a way of life, a piece of my family's history. I never wanted to be rich, just wanted to make a decent living while doing something that felt genuine. The way you folks stepped in, it's like a second chance." Their conversation drifted from personal stories to the next steps for the farm. By the time Ben left, the moon was high, and a sense of serene fulfillment lingered in Hank's heart. He sat on the porch with Barney curled at his feet, thinking about how, 1 week ago, he had been a man on the brink, and now the entire trajectory of his life had changed. All because he stopped to help a stranger with a broken truck. By midsummer, the improvements had progressed enough to be visible from the road. Neighbors gawked at the transformed fields, which were now planted with a rotation of cover crops to restore nutrients, along with sections earmarked for orchard development. Rita's analysis revealed that the southwestern corner of Hank's land was perfect for fruit trees if they managed the water supply properly. Initially, Hank found the idea of an orchard on Morrow Acres surprising, but the more he listened to Rita's explanations about market demand for fresh peaches or apples, the more it seemed viable. Some fruit might go to local markets, while other parts could be sold in bulk or turned into preserves, creating an alternative revenue stream. Meanwhile, the bank's calls softened in tone once they realized the property was increasing in value. Hank had a preliminary meeting with a loan officer, bringing along documents detailing the improvements and projected returns. For once, the banker sounded impressed, hinting that they could restructure the mortgage if the orchard and improved cropland started generating a stable income. Hank left that meeting feeling a weight lifted. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but at least foreclosure was no longer looming like a vulture overhead. Miguel's irrigation system proved transformative. He installed drip lines that delivered water directly to the roots of each plant, drastically reducing waste. Hank was amazed at how much water he saved compared to his old method of flooding certain rows with a garden hose. The soils improved with each passing week, as the cover crops took root, loosening the earth and depositing organic matter. And even though it wasn't an instant fix, farming always required patience. Hank could already see patches of green surging through the once barren land. A sense of accomplishment glowed in his chest whenever he walked those rows, greeted by the sight of sprouts that signaled a rebirth of the farm he'd once feared was lost. In addition to the agricultural endeavors, the Green Horizons team proposed setting aside a portion of Hank's far northern acreage for a reforestation project. This area was rocky and sloped, making it less ideal for row crops, but potentially excellent for planting native trees and shrubs. At first, Hank worried it would take up too much of his land, but Rita explained that reforestation provided ecological benefits, helping with erosion control and biodiversity. She also assured him that once the trees were established, they'd require minimal ongoing care. The philanthropic fund would pay him an annual fee to keep that section untouched. Aside from maintenance, meaning Hank would generate revenue simply by letting nature do its work. Intrigued and a little awestruck, he agreed, thinking how his father would have liked the idea of letting the hillside revert to a wooded habitat. Every few days, Hank received more paperwork to sign, various notices about what was planted, how much seed was used, or updates on the orchard layout. The bureaucracy might have been overwhelming, if not for the help of Sharon and others on the team who guided him through it. Hank found it oddly thrilling to read about new soil test results, to learn that nitrogen levels had risen to a healthy range, or that the orchard saplings were taking root faster than expected. He devoured agricultural articles in the evenings, studying up on modern techniques, determined to pull his weight in this collaboration. He no longer wanted to be the naive farmer left behind by the times. He wanted to be an active participant in Morrow Acres' renaissance. Meanwhile, Ben continued to visit occasionally, always with a cordial demeanor. Sometimes they'd walk the farm together, discussing new proposals. Other times, they'd sit in the kitchen for a cup of coffee, talking about life in general. Ben might mention a story from his childhood farm, or share insights from other Green Horizons projects in distant states. Hank looked forward to these visits, not just because Ben was effectively his benefactor, but because Hank valued the genuine friendship that had blossomed from a single roadside encounter. In a world that often seemed transactional, their bond felt refreshingly authentic. As summer transitioned into early autumn, the orchard saplings had grown to a point where their progress was undeniable. Small leaves fluttered in the breeze, a sign that, come spring, they might bloom. The cover crops were almost ready to be plowed under to enrich the soil further. Hank marveled at the transformation every morning. Instead of waking with dread, he woke with purpose, eager to check on the orchard, to meet with the next wave of Green Horizons, workers who might be installing an upgraded fence or adjusting irrigation lines. Even the livestock thrived, thanks to better feed and a stable environment. Hank expanded his little goat herd, figuring that in the coming year, he might have enough grazing area for them without competing with the orchard for resources. One crisp afternoon, Hank decided to tackle a corner of the barn he had long neglected, clearing out junk that had piled up over the years. Old metal scraps, broken tools, a disused water trough. As he worked, he thought back to the times when he had felt so alone in these tasks, pushing himself to exhaustion just to maintain the status quo. Now, with the partnership in place, he felt a sense of shared effort. Everyone pitched in, from Ben to the specialized teams, each focusing on their area of expertise. It was no longer a solitary struggle. It was a collective endeavor. He paused to catch his breath, leaning on a broom, smiling to himself. He realized just how remarkable it was that one act of kindness the day he stopped to patch up an old truck head snowballed into an opportunity that was saving his farm. That same evening, as the sun painted the sky in hues of pink and orange, Hank found himself strolling the orchard rows alongside Rita. She was explaining how, over time, the orchard could expand or shift to different varieties if the market demanded it. Hank listened intently, absorbing the possibilities. Eventually, they reached the edge of the orchard, where the new reforestation zone began. Rows of tiny saplings extended up the rocky slope, the young trees braced by stakes to help them withstand wind. The sight moved Hank. It represented not just profit or practicality, but a hopeful vision for the future trees that would stand for decades, even after he was gone. Rita excused herself to check some measurements, leaving Hank alone with his thoughts. He paced among the young saplings, recalling the day he had first seen the truck stranded on that dusty road. A week's time, that was all it took for everything to start turning around. He closed his eyes for a moment, grateful for how life had proven that a small gesture of helping someone in need could lead to extraordinary blessings. The gentle breeze carried the sound of rustling leaves, as if the orchard itself were whispering in agreement. Autumn deepened, painting the surroundings in gold and russet tones. The orchard leaves fluttered, some turning color more vividly than Hank had expected. The cover crops, having served their purpose of rebuilding soil fertility, were tilled back into the earth, creating a richer seedbed for the next planting cycle. Green Horizons sent additional laborers to help with finishing touches on the irrigation lines, and a new round of soil samples indicated that Morrow Acres was well on its way to rejuvenation. Encouraged by these positive developments, Hank spoke again with his bank representative, presenting the updated farm value, the orchard growth plans, and the contract from Green Horizons that guaranteed DAS. Certain annual fees and profit shares. Though the bank was notoriously slow-moving, the rep acknowledged that Hank's finances were improving. They tentatively agreed to restructure the mortgage, reducing the threat of foreclosure and potentially lowering Hank's monthly payments once the orchard started producing income. Hank left that meeting with a light step, feeling as though he had finally dispelled a cloud that had hovered over him for years. In late October, Ben arrived for a celebratory visit of sorts, wanting to see how everything had come together before winter set in. He walked the rows with Hank, remarking on the orchard saplings, the newly amended soil, and the steady trickle of the drip lines. They ended up at Hank's front porch, sipping hot coffee in the chill autumn air. Then, leaning against the porch railing, turned to Hank and offered a broad grin. "You know," Ben said thoughtfully, "when my truck gave out on that road, I was on my way to scout properties in another state altogether. Fate had different plans. If I hadn't broken down, I might never have found Morrow Acres. Hank nodded, meeting Ben's eyes. And if I had kept driving without stopping, none of this would have happened. They shared a quiet laugh, acknowledging the unlikelihood of their meeting. For a while, they simply listened to the wind stirring the leaves. Finally, Ben set his coffee mug down, his expression growing serious. Next year is going to be big for you, Hank. The orchard will need careful tending, but once it matures, you'll have a real source of stable income. The reforestation project, too, will draw attention. Green Horizons might even do a small event here to show donors where their funds are going. Hank felt a twinge of nerves. He wasn't used to events or donors. He was a simple farmer, yet he recognized the value of showcasing the project, especially if it meant more resources for the land. "Whatever helps the mission," he replied. "I'm just glad to see the farm thriving again. Even if we don't make a fortune, we're alive, and that's more than I could say before." Ben nodded. "Exactly. Sometimes just staying afloat is the biggest victory. But I have a feeling you'll do more than float. Something about you, Hank, your heart is in the right place. People see that, they respect it. That's why Green Horizons is proud to work with you." A warmth spread through Hank's chest, overshadowing the chill of the evening. They talked a while longer, eventually parting ways with a handshake and mutual promises to keep in close contact. As Ben's truck disappeared into the twilight, Hank lingered on the porch, gazing at the horizon. He remembered how lonely these nights used to feel, how each day felt like stepping into a ring with an opponent far stronger than him, be it debt, drought, or despair. Now, the nights felt full of potential, and the loneliness had lessened, replaced by the knowledge that a whole team stood behind him, investing time and resources into land he once feared was doomed. Winter came early that year, blanketing the fields in a pristine layer of snow. The orchard saplings lay dormant, protected by burlap wraps around their trunks, while the reforestation area remained still and silent, the infant trees patiently waiting for spring. Hank, no longer dreading the season of rest, used the downtime to study orchard management in more detail. He corresponded with Rita, asking questions about pruning and pest control, planning for the months when the snow would melt and the orchard would require careful attention. He also began drawing up designs for a small farm stand, fantasizing about selling fruit and local products directly to passers-by when the orchard matured. It felt liberating to dream again, rather than merely survive. Ben kept his word and arranged a meeting of potential donors in January, a small gathering in town rather than on the farm, due to the icy conditions. Hank was nervous to attend, not knowing what to say to well-dressed strangers from the city. But he went anyway, wanting to represent Morrow Acres and express gratitude. When he arrived at the modest community center, he found a group of about 20 people, mostly business types, philanthropic sponsors, and a few local officials. Ben introduced Hank to them, highlighting his story as an example of how Green Horizons' approach could rescue small farms. Hank gave a short, heartfelt speech, describing how hopeless he had felt before this opportunity, and how the farm was now moving towards sustainability. He noticed more than a few donors wiping tears, clearly moved by his honesty. That evening, he left with a deeper appreciation of how many people wanted to help rural communities, if only they found the right connection. When spring eventually thawed the land, the orchard began to show its first real signs of vigor. Tiny buds appeared on the branches, coaxed into life by the warming temperatures. Hank roamed the rows daily, carefully pruning any damaged twigs, adjusting the drip system, and removing weeds that threatened to choke the young trees. The reforestation zone also sprang back to life, with early wildflowers dotting the forest floor between the saplings. Birds sang from the branches, a testament to the thriving habitat the project had created. Hank reveled in the energy of it all, working from dawn until dusk with a renewed sense of purpose. Late one afternoon, as he guided his old tractor along the edge of the orchard, he found himself thinking back over the past months, the day he met Ben, the desperate fear of losing the farm, the hurried reading of the contract, the arrival of the soil team. It all felt like a dream. Yet here he was, a man whose once neglected farmland was now a growing oasis. He chuckled softly, imagining telling his late father about the orchard. His father might have marveled at the rows of budding saplings, playfully mocking Hank for taking so long to see the possibilities. Yet Hank sensed his father would be proud that he hadn't sold out to some faceless corporation, that he kept the spirit of family farming alive. On a whim, Hank parked the tractor near the property's boundary and hopped off. He walked among the orchard trees, letting the gentle breeze carry the scent of fertile earth. The sky was a deep azure, dotted with wisps of cloud, and the sun hung low, casting elongated shadows. Eventually, he reached the line that separated the orchard from the reforestation zone, the point where farmland faded into newly planted saplings that would someday grow tall. He stood there, gazing at the horizon, letting the magnitude of his journey sink in. A week after he helped a stranger with a broken truck, everything changed. And that was the best part. It changed not just for him, but for everyone connected to Morrow Acres Green Horizons, the local economy, the environment, and maybe, if he dared dream bigger, future generations who might inherit a healthier, more vibrant land. He inhaled deeply, feeling the cool air fill his lungs, then exhaled slowly, as if releasing the remnants of past burdens. The lessons he had learned were profound. That kindness could unlock doors no amount of money or planning could, that a broken-down truck on a scorching day could lead to new life blossoming on a once-failing farm, and that there was power in community, in bridging the gap between a struggling farmer and the people who had the resources to help. Hank smiled, turning back toward the orchard, the sun warming his back, as he headed home to see Barney and prepare for another day in a future that now gleamed with promise. Spring melted into a gentle summer, and Morrow Acres thrummed with activity. The orchard offered its first modest yield, small but vibrant fruit that Hank proudly showed to any neighbor who would listen. The reforestation zone continued to develop, supported by the philanthropic funds. Hank worked closely with Rita, Miguel, and other team members, discussing how best to expand the orchard or if adding a greenhouse might be beneficial. Green Horizons suggested new avenues for generating income, like a small agritourism venture, perhaps opening the orchard to pick her own visitors. Hank found the notion intimidating, but also exhilarating. He was beginning to see that his farm could be more than a static operation. It could be a place that engaged the community, educated people about sustainable practices, and provided a welcoming space for those yearning for a taste of country life. The bank, impressed by Morrow Acres' transformation, agreed to a partial refinance that lightened Hank's mortgage load significantly. With each passing month, the farm became less of a liability and more of an asset. Hank caught himself smiling at odd times, like when he was fueling up his pickup in town, or when he was in the feed store, overhearing other farmers complain about the price of fertilizer. He still shared those frustrations, but now he had a sense of hope that was unshakable. He occasionally helped other local farmers by sharing what he'd learned, encouraging them to explore new methods or to check if Green Horizons had programs that could help them too. Whenever Hank had a free moment, he'd recall the day he first laid eyes on Ben's broken truck, how the engine hissed steam into the scorching afternoon. He remembered wrestling with duct tape and water bottles, half convinced the old vehicle wouldn't start. The older man's gratitude had seemed excessive at the time, juiced a handshake and a few thank yous. Yet that day was the spark that rekindled a farm's future. Hank often wondered how different his life would be if he had simply driven by without offering assistance, too consumed by his own troubles to help another soul. The thought always sent a chill down his spine, a reminder that life's biggest turns can hinge on seemingly small decisions. By late summer, the orchard's second wave of fruit emerged, enough to begin small-scale sales at the local farmers market. Hank's produce stand was a humble affair, a wooden table decorated with a homemade sign reading Morrow Acres Orchard Fresh and Sustainable. But the response from townsfolk was overwhelmingly positive. People wanted to support the orchard's mission and taste fruit grown using minimal chemicals and efficient watering systems. Hank sold out of peaches on the first day, stunned by the demand. He spent hours afterward, mentally planning how to scale up next season. Green Horizons, meanwhile, was finalizing the reforestation part of the project, ensuring that the trees would be well cared for through the colder months. They also scheduled a volunteer day, inviting community members to help with mulching, clearing invasive weeds, and learning about conservation. Hank watched in gratitude as a handful of neighbors, local college students, and even a few families with children came to spend a day among the saplings. The volunteers planted wildflowers and placed protective tubes around the young trees to shield them from deer. Smiles and laughter filled the air, transforming what had once been a neglected slope into a living classroom for environmental stewardship. Ben made a special trip for that volunteer day, walking the rows and greeting participants. He and Hank found a moment of quiet near the barn where the volunteers had gathered for cold drinks and sandwiches. Ben clasped Hank's shoulder, eyes shining with pride. "Look at all this," he said, gesturing at the orchard, the reforested slope, the cluster of people chatting happily in the summer sun. "In 1 year, we've managed to bring a place back from near abandonment. And it's just the start. Imagine what Morrow Acres will look like in 5 or 10 years. Hank's voice caught in his throat. He took off his hat, running a hand through his hair. "I can't thank you and your team enough. This place used to feel like a prison of debt. Now it feels like a promise." Ben smiled, nodding at the orchard. "You deserve it, Hank. You put the work in and day out. We gave you some tools, but you've been the one driving the change. That's the beauty of it. It's your farm. And you made this happen. All because you saw someone in need and decided to lend a hand." Tears pricked at Hank's eyes, though he tried to hide them behind a small laugh. He stared out at the orchard rows, where the fruit-laden branches swayed gently in the breeze. Nearby, volunteers were eagerly taking pictures of the reforestation area, marveling at the difference a few months had made. Hank breathed in the sweet scent of sun-warmed leaves and freshly turned earth, letting that smell remind him of how far he had come. As the day wound down and the volunteers began to disperse, Hank found a moment to stand by his truck, the same vehicle he had driven when he stumbled upon Ben's broken-down ride. Barty hopped onto the passenger seat, tail wagging. Hank glanced at the dog, thinking about how life had changed so drastically in what felt like a blink. He placed a hand on the truck's warm hood, recalling the moment he'd parked behind Ben on the side of a lonely highway, never suspecting that an act of mechanical generosity would spark a story of rebirth. He closed his eyes, sending a silent thanks into the evening, thankful to the land for being patient, thankful to Ben for returning kindness tenfold, and thankful for the newfound determination within himself, which he had never quite tapped into until necessity and opportunity collided. That night, Hank dreamt of the orchard in full bloom, heavy with fruit so vibrant it glimmered under the sunlight. In that dream, he was neither rushing nor worrying. He walked slowly down the rows, greeting every tree, feeling an expansive sense of belonging. Birds sang, and the reforested slope rolled out in the distance like a peaceful painting. When he awoke, the morning light filtering through his window, the feelings from that dream lingered, a quiet assurance that everything was going to be all right. He rose, got dressed, and walked outside with Barney. The two made their usual rounds, checking the livestock in the orchard. Hank paused by the orchard's entrance, nodding to a small sign Green Horizons had erected that read, "Morrow Acres, in collaboration with Green Horizons, growing a future together." The last word echoed in his mind. Together. That was the essence of it all. The farm had been saved not by a solo feat, but through a chain reaction of connection. One man helping another, a philanthropic vision meeting a farmer's passion, and a community rallying around a mission of renewal. No longer was Hank a lone figure battling against impossible odds. He was part of something bigger, a partnership that blended tradition with innovation, past heartbreak with future promise. A sense of calm settled over him as he walked down the row of orchard trees. Dew glistened on the leaves, and the early sun gave everything a soft glow. In his pocket was his phone, which he checked now and then, expecting a call from a local store wanting more peaches. He'd likely need to deliver crates of them later that afternoon, a chore he was happy to have. He also had a meeting scheduled with Miguel to discuss the winterization of the drip system, ensuring the lines wouldn't burst when the temperature dropped. There was always more work to do, but it felt purposeful, not crushing. He passed the orchard, and continued toward the reforestation zone, letting his feet carry him along a faint path that meandered through young trees. Many were knee-high, some taller, all reflecting the promise of future shade and habitat. He reached a little clearing that looked out over the rest of Morrow Acres. The view took his breath away for a moment, seeing the orchard, the barns, the farmhouse, and the distant fields. Memories overlapped. The gloom he felt a year ago versus the pride he felt now. He heard the quiet rustle of leaves above him, imagined them whispering about change, resilience, and the blessings that come when you put faith in the decency of strangers. Hank inhaled the crisp morning air, exhaled a silent prayer of gratitude, and headed back down the slope. There was no time to lose. He had fruit to pick, fields to tend, and a future to nurture, a future that had been made possible by one small act of kindness on a hot day. And by an older man who appeared with a truck that refused to start, only to return a week later with legal papers and an extraordinary opportunity. No matter what challenges lay ahead, Hank felt certain he could handle them, because Morrow Acres was no longer just a dream. It was a thriving